Good morning, everyone. So we're now in the second session, which we move the perspective from the middle power countries to the countries that are referred to as fledgling, although some of them are not really, like mine, are not really so fledgling, just repeatedly dropped. Uh, the question really here now, and the title of the session is Local Democratic Values and Prospect for Democratic Unity in Asia, is asking whether these so-called fledgling or troubled democracies can identify embedded local values for democracy and use this to bring unity among ourselves and with middle power countries and to the bigger international democracy community. So really three parts: defining the supposedly locally embedded values for democracy, which I think at this particular time is not that easy or simple to answer, when you can see how some populist leaders in fact turn around what you had assumed to be strongly embedded values for democracy and get to run away with the misrepresentations and the manipulation impact of these values. So that's one part. The second part is how to use this, coming from these local values, to be able to use this to bring unity and therefore strengthening of democracies among this level of countries to the middle power and the larger international community. And third part is really just deepening that second part. Is we hope that there will be some concrete suggestions about how to do this, because some countries, and I will say my country in particular, are so troubled that really concrete suggestions are going to be extremely valuable, that we don't stay on the level of what should be done or generic strategies into some maybe examples that we can take on and take home and work towards. We have four panelists for this morning, for the second session. Nishan Del Mel from Sri Lanka is the Executive Director of Heritage Research. Ira Ashari from Malaysia is the Coordinator of Democracy and Governance Unit of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. To my left is Tawilwati Buripul, Director of Research and Development Office of the King Prajathipok's Institute in Thailand. And Chin En Wu is Associate Research Fellow of Academia Sinica of Taiwan, which I saw in the list is really a middle power country. Tiny middle power. So okay, that gives us hope that there are stages. I in fact would support that, to think of the middle power countries as having also levels that some of the middle power countries may be closer to where we are than some others. To stay within our time, the suggestion is that we do 10 minutes each presentation, and we would hope that there would be more time for exchange afterwards. So, shall we take it?
Thank you. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you to Dr. Lee for really championing this thought process and organizing this event. I think it's an important discussion. Since I have only 10 minutes, I will organize my input in three parts. I'll talk about values, about governance, and about discourse. Okay, and in each of them, I will say three things. Let me start with values, because that is the foundational kind of question with which we are engaging. And I'll be trying to talk from the Sri Lankan perspective, because I think that's what we are looking for here, the country perspective. The sense of what the rooted values of Sri Lanka are, and I think it's true for many other countries, is complicated by a colonial history. There are many ways in which Sri Lanka's own value systems, Buddhism, have been transformed and Protestantized during our colonial history, and what we consider to be Sri Lankan values are often sometimes values that have intermingled with Christian values and Western values, but also are not quite the same and have different histories and a different evolutionary trajectory, if you like. But I think three values that I want to talk about in which we need to look at translating our own history and our cultural understanding into something that also works within democracy. Let's take pluralism first, because we were talking yesterday about populism and how populism can be anti-pluralistic in many ways. We have two ways in which pluralism is challenged in Sri Lanka. One is and that's true of South other South Asian countries with a post-colonial history. After independence, the nation building can take a particular path. India took the path of nation building around a very secular state approach. But Sri Lanka began nation building around an ethnic majority. And redefining the nation in terms of the singular majority, and that is because there is a nation building challenge after a colonial experience. You have to rethink what is the glue that holds your country and your society together. And that glue is not easy to construct without a long historical or a thought process. And in many ways, ethnic-based nation building, and India is discovering it late, becomes easy. And in fact, the structure of democratic, electoral democracy lends itself to it, because it is a cheap and easy technique for politicians to use ethnic-based nationalistic rhetoric to capture votes. Because the majorities in countries like ours also suffer from a sense of colonial victimization. And so it is easy to tap into the psyche of victimization of the majority and have the majority function effectively with a minority complex that sees themselves as under threat and therefore must somehow consolidate power in that identity. And Sinhalese and Buddhism are both globally weak cultures. Sinhalese is only spoken in Sri Lanka. And Theravada Buddhism, the particular form of Buddhism that Sri Lanka embraces, is only maybe practiced in Myanmar, other than Sri Lanka. And so Sri Lanka has a kind of a Buddhist Zionistic fervor that we are the protectors of this particular type of Buddhism. And we are the protectors of the Sinhala culture, which will be gone forever if we don't protect it. So actually building a nation building around Sinhala Buddhism is available easily, and democratic electoral processes lend themselves to it. And so the question of how we talk about pluralism and how we move pluralism in that context, move towards a more pluralistic society in that context, is a significant challenge. The second area I think that we have to think, and I think this is true of other Asian countries also, that they have this problem in different ways. The second one is on rights. Okay, I think all of us in Asia understand that in relation to the West, our concept of how we think about rights is not so rooted in the sense of an individual. And there's resistance to thinking in terms of atomistic individual rights. So often you hear the question of group rights, communal rights, religious-based rights, group identity-based rights. And the Western approach to rights, which is so important, I think, in many ways in a democratic society, is built around a different philosophical, cultural heritage, which doesn't translate very well to the Asian, South Asian context. So what I want to say in talking about all of these things on values is that there's a problem of translation. How do you translate pluralism into our context and into our history? How do you translate rights into that history? Because if you leave it, if democracy is only supported by Western organizations and Western countries, they will invariably attempt to do it in the way that they understand it, which then is not an easy fit within the Sri Lankan society. And what has happened is we have started looking at Western NGOs and Western investment in this value-based civil society as an interference in our countries, as foreign interference. And NGO is a bad word in Sri Lanka as a result, okay? Because it's seen as a way of imposing a neo-colonial influence that is somehow undermining local government and local democracy in that sense. The last is equity, and I think what we said yesterday also was that in many ways the importance of the success of democracy being based on reducing poverty, on improving wealth, on the success of the economic projects has been forgotten sometimes when we promote democracy. That democracy that doesn't deliver economic improvements and well-being gets discredited easily. And the success of China and the China model, the Singaporean model, these have become fetishes for people only because they see the economic success, right? And that economic success, so we mustn't underestimate the value of equity and promoting a more equitable society. And gender equity becomes a special kind of problem because in our societies, like in East Asian societies, women are the harbingers of our ancient culture. We put an extra burden on women to function and behave in a different way that protects symbolically our cultural values and projection of our cultural roots. And so these also, but we have other traditions that enormously respect the figure of the mother. And women are respected in different ways. So translating equity, gender equity even, rights and pluralism based on our history and based on our culture is something that I think Asian middle powers are in a position to assist with or get engaged in because they understand the problem of having a different historical and evolutionary path into this kind of value system that is important for democracy, and we can't simply leave it to Western organizations to do that. Time is going to run out, so let me go quickly through the other two. The second is governance, and I think that we understand that democracy is about also a system of governance that has checks and balances, that has well-functioning institutions. And in many ways, some of the countries like Sri Lanka built excellent bureaucracies during the colonial period. But we now have an outdated technology of government. We have still, the countries that colonized us have evolved, changed, improved themselves in enormous ways. We have stuck to old systems, old bureaucracies, old regulations that we haven't changed, and we've also underinvested in the capacity of our bureaucrats. And so we have a broken technology of government. And I think if we were, and one of the odd things is that when, say, what we call middle power countries in Asia, come to assist Sri Lanka, they like to assist hard infrastructure. Japan, Korea, Koika, they want to build traffic systems, train systems, roads, logistics. When you want investment in soft infrastructure, values, human rights, transparency, good governance, you look to the West. So I would say it's important for middle powers to look at reprogramming assistance from hard infrastructure to soft infrastructure. And how do you improve the judiciary to act as and improve the functioning of judiciary? Some of the middle powers have managed to see their judiciaries improve and act as a check on the executive and on the legislature. Anti-corruption, Hong Kong, Korea, Singapore have demonstrated enormous progress on anti-corruption, and yet corruption remains a huge discrediting factor of our democratic systems. Today, Sri Lanka is calling publicly many people for authoritarian government because they see that as the only way to fix corruption. They don't believe the democratic system is helping them to fix corruption. Even Modi, the rise of authoritarianism is around corruption. And last of all, this concept of good governance as being fair, equitable, meritorious government is being undermined by neo-patrimonial structures that are emerging in our societies. It's also true in Africa, where old habits of feudal, hierarchical arrangements are infiltrating the governance culture and have over a long time and haven't been reformed adequately. So abuse of power, nepotism to police torture are not adequately challenged. And again, when the West challenges it, the neo-patrimonialism responds with by saying it's a threat of neo-colonialism. I won't go to my third point because I want to try and keep to time, but certainly when we come back on the discussion, let me talk about the discourse, which was my third point, and stop with these two for the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning. Firstly, I'm going to mention about ASEAN, not only Thailand, because it's sub-region in Asia and become more important in my opinion. And since ASEAN country is considered to be young democracy, almost every country, except Indonesia. And there are almost 700 million people living there, and in this region there are a lot of diversity, starting from politics, religion, language, culture, and many kinds of things. But they form ASEAN, and it's surprisingly they can live together. Indonesia, we can say that is quite mature democracy compared to the other countries. Semi-democracy, maybe some, and non-democracy. Thailand can be classified as non-democracy, but if we have election, then we can move to semi-democracy. And then from ASEAN Barometer survey is very interesting. Everyone in ASEAN said that, okay, they are happy with the way democracy works in their own country, they're satisfied with the democracy. But the problem in this region is the consolidation of democracy. Because we test it, according to ASEAN, ABS, Asian Barometer Survey, we found that from the important question, the government should decide whether certain ideas should be allowed to be discussed in the society. And another question, the government leaders are like the head of the family. We should all follow their decision. Compare that to democracy, that's been the middle power, like Japan, South Korea. The people disagree with this. More than half of the people in these countries disagree with this concept. But less than half of the people living in ASEAN disagree. That means majority of them accept the idea that the government should be like the leader and the head of the family, so let the government decide things. And we dig more, and we found that like you don't talk about Vietnam, only 8% disagree that the government should decide whether certain ideas should be allowed to be discussed in society, compared to 14% in Cambodia, 24% in Malaysia, 43% in Singapore, 39% in Indonesia, and 45% in Thailand, compared to 81% in Taiwan, and 87% in Japan, and South Korea, 58%. So you see, it's very much different. And what happened in these countries, because of the value or the concept of democracy, they like democracy, they said, but the substance of democracy is problematic.
With ASEAN, they have ASEAN community, but it seems to concentrate more on economic development, social progress, and cultural development, especially prosperous and peaceful community. They talk very less on politics and democracy. And the people in ASEAN feel very low close to ASEAN. Asking about how close do you feel, and very much close, the percentage of the people that said about this is very low. Like in Thailand, only 5.6% said they feel so close to ASEAN, compared to 1.4% of Indonesia and 30% in Myanmar, and 9.6% in Singapore, and 7.4% in Philippines, for example. So what happened? I'm going to come back to Thailand. Starting from changing from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy in 1932, we passed 20 constitution and 13 coup d'etat. And the reason why the military come out and exercise their power mostly related to the corrupt government, malfunction of the government, and the formal system cannot check the exercise of the state power, cannot bring the corrupt government down. So it's become the duty of military to come into power. That means the problem of balance of power and the understanding of democracy. The people cannot endure the democratization process, and politicians themselves that they don't improve their own performance, and democratic value is very weak, and that means the democratic institutions seem to be so weak in Thailand and maybe in other countries in ASEAN also. What should we do? We try to learn the concept of democracy from the Western region, but with the culture, with the context in our region, I think it's like go parallel instead of go together. Sometimes it's go different way with the democratic value, because what we taught, like we should walk after the adult in order to do something, to protect us, to prevent the dog to bite you. You have to follow the leader, for example. That's not democratic value. So I propose that we should look at the social quality, the consequences of democracy. Look at democracy, not only the process like election, but look at the substance of democracy that include good governance, human rights, human dignity that the former session mentioned about. And the consequences of this should look at the, instead of quality of life, but looking at social quality. The concept that the expert, the academic from Europe introduced, that starting from socio-economic security. Without socio-economic security, the people will not care about democracy at all. They're looking at their own money. And then the social cohesion. And that means the trust and the member in civil society, make the people have time together. And then social inclusion, this is very important. The former session mentioned a lot about dignity, equity. So social inclusion is very important in ASEAN, I think, because it leads to human rights practice and equity coming. And also, since we are very pluralist, I mean, so the social inclusion is very important. In order to achieve this, we need social empowerment. So what we should do is empowering the democratization in this country in order that we achieve sustainable peace. Before having sustainable peace, we need sustainable development. And in order to achieve sustainable justice, without sustainable justice, we never achieve sustainable peace. So that's I would like to mention.
In the interest of gender diversity,
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about how East Asian view the influence of China and American. because in East Asia we are facing two superpower, China and American, and China is more close and economic more intertwined with this region, but it's an authoritarian regime. And America is a democracy, but it's far away. And economically, we have export to United States, but it's not so intertwined. And we know that it's well known in the Eurasia country that surround Russia. They have the most pro-American population in the world. So it's in a similar fashion, we can see that there are many countries that surround China, and the people there are quite pro-American. So we are going to discuss if it's the case and what the role liberal democratic value play, and the people with higher liberal democratic value tend to have a negative image of China and a more positive image of the United States. If we see the correlation between the two, the people's democratic value and their perception of the United States, if you take the country average, so then we will see there's no clear relationship between the liberal democratic value and their perception of China and the United States, because they have some countries they are quite liberal, like Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, Hong Kong, and they are tended to have a more negative view of China and the positive view of the United States. But we also can find in the less liberal part of the Asia, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and they are also have people there tend to also have a negative view of China and a positive view of the United States. So probably there are other factors they are coming to play, and so like in Northeast Asia, probably liberal democratic value is important because there is institutional difference between China and those countries. But there are also, of course, other historical background, and in this less democratic part of the region, and they probably is not driven by liberal democratic value, but probably their fear of China or investment from China and the worry about sovereignty. So if we look into individual country, and we will find that people there who are more liberal in each country tend to hold a more negative view of China, and this is pretty much the case in either the more liberal part of the region, like Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and also in the more or less free part of the region, like Cambodia, Myanmar, and Vietnam. And for the middle part, the country with some kind of hybrid regime, or the country with the medium liberal democratic value, they tend to also, people there for the with high liberal democratic value tend to have a more negative view of China, but the degree are much smaller. So this is quite consistent across the East Asia. For example, in Taiwan, that people who are liberal, have a more liberal democratic value, tend to hold a more negative view of China, and they tend to think that the government, because at the past few years, Taiwan government have a more pro-China policy. They are more friendly to China, and they think the supervision of government is not enough. So they want to have more supervision, and if government has not done enough, probably they should go to the street or even do something aggressive to stop the closer relationship between the two. So that's the one part. Another part is about United States, and the East East Asians' view about United States is more divergent. And in general, they are favor the presence of the United States, but the liberal have slightly different view. The liberal view in the liberal part of the region, like Japan and South Korea, they tend to be, on average, they still have, they favor the presence of the United States, but they are more cautious about the influence of the United States than those with low democratic value in their country. Because probably, I think it's because of the U.S. troops, U.S. Army in those two countries. So they think Americans' influence as a potential threat to their sovereignty. And for countries that also have high liberal democratic value, like in Taiwan and Hong Kong, the China poses a serious threat to their existence. So the people with high liberal democratic value in these two regions tend to favor U.S. presence in this region. And finally, the countries that are less liberal, they tend to view the U.S. more favorably, because those countries like in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Vietnam, they are economically relatively weak compared to mainland China, and they are adjacent to mainland China, and either in land or in territory sea. So they feel the threshold very clear. And on the other hand, they don't have, at this moment, they don't have a U.S. troop in their country. So U.S. does not pose a threat to their sovereignty. So they welcome the liberal people who hold a high liberal democratic value tend to welcome Americans' presence in this region. And finally, we see the country with the hybrid regime, like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. They are interesting because they are not the first-tier countries around China. They are second-tier. Right? So they are in the threat from mainland China is that it's not that strong. So the liberal democratic, the people hold a high liberal democratic value. They do not see China's influence as very negative. But on the other hand, they are more likely to think the influence of America are negative, because to them, the China is the threat is not very serious because they are second-tier countries. So that's why they have a somewhat cautious view of the presence of the United States. So I just summarized using the Asian barometer value data and to divide the region, sub-region, to see how liberal democratic value affect people's choice between the two superpower. One is democratic, one is authoritarian regimes. And but the one we often miss is the role of China itself, because China is also in East Asia, and there are so many people. And from the data show that the Chinese actually has a very high democratic value. In the surveys conducted in 2015, if you compare to countries like in other countries, Mongolia, and those new democracy, Chinese people actually has a higher democratic value. But just that their political system is tighten their control. So how to engage with Chinese people might be the important text for us, for those of the middle power country. That probably we should not only think about United States, but we also need to, and also we not only need to think about United States and how to contain China, probably we should need to think more about how to engage Chinese people, because they are free. They are liberal-minded, how to contact them and to make change in their political system. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, hi. Thanks again for letting me go last. So hi, I'm Ira from Ideas Malaysia. I'm going to try and simplify this and keep my points, make 3 main points. So the first thing is the roots of democratic values in Malaysia. I think we need to go back to history and to how Malaysia was gain our independence to gain some kind of understanding of this. So in Southeast Asia, I think Malaysia stands out amongst the very few former British colonies and that gained our independence in 1957. And independence was, generally given to us by the British in cooperation with the Malay elites then, which was the United Malays National Organization (UMNO), which is the dominant political party in the National Front coalition, Barisan Nasional, and this way of getting independence, which was through compromise and not through revolutionary bloodshed like some of our other neighbors, is something that Malaysians and UMNO is very proud of until today. Although arguably that there was only one side of the independence story in Malaysia, and our founding father Tunku Abdul Rahman, who was our first prime minister, he was very much an Anglophile, educated in Cambridge, and very much influenced by these values of individual liberty, liberal democracy, which is fitting to his training in Cambridge as a lawyer. And despite this, he realized at the time, because of the context of how Malayan society was at the time, that there was a need to compromise this because there was a majority Malay population at the time who I like to borrow Nishan's phrase, which I like, who felt colonially victimized. So this colonial victimization mentality of the Malay population at the time, who felt, we are the natives of this land, but then you guys, the British, brought in mass numbers of Chinese and Indians, to work in the tin mines and in the rubber tapping industry, and that give the Chinese population especially a significantly higher position economically compared to the majority Malays, who the British really aimed for them to serve in the public administration of the country. So he realized this at the time, and the UMNO grassroots was also very restless and very against the idea of an egalitarian Malaya, which put the Malays, the Chinese, Indians, and the indigenous communities at the same level. So our constitution was constructed around this. Article 153 of the Malaysian constitution until today prescribes a special position for the Malays, which says that entitles Malays to quotas in public service, in public education. It has now expanded to a whole load of other different affirmative action policies, and the Malay language was made the national language of the Federation. Although it is, despite that, it is common to see today many Malaysians who are not Malay, Chinese Malaysians or Indian Malaysians who are not fluent in the national language, and I think there is some maybe some failure in the formation of a national identity there. Islam was also made the religion of the Federation in the constitution at the time, and there was a lot of contention on this, but again this was done for practical reasons. They had to appeal to the context of the time, and I think also unique to Malaya at the time compared to the region, the position of the monarchy stayed intact. So Malaysia is also unique in the sense that we have 9 royal families, one for each, the states in the federation, and you have one king that rotates every 5 years amongst his 9 families. So the monarchy remained intact, and even when the British came to Malaya, they struck a deal with the sultans and sort of left Islamic and Malay affairs to them, and the British would then go on to collect taxes and such from the local population. So this is important, I think, to take into account when we talk about Malaysia's democratic values. So the monarchy is of course a constitutional monarchy under a parliamentary democracy, but Malaysia still remains very much a feudal society where criticism of the monarchy is could land you in jail and is really not something that people generally discuss openly. So secondly, I would like to say something about the formal democracy that Malaysia has enjoyed until today. So as many of you probably know, the National Front coalition led by UMNO then have been ruled Malaysia for all of our independent history up until the most recent elections. And for all intents and purposes, we have enjoyed a formal democracy. We've had elections every 5 years. Transitions of power, although it hasn't been from different political parties, but every time we had elections, people generally accepted the results. There's never been violent uprisings or anything like that. So these formal structures of democracy exist. And then in the 1980s, which was the beginning of Mahathir's 1.0 rule, many of the civil liberties that Malaysians, I think, relatively enjoyed before started getting eroded. There was a 1988 judicial crisis where the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court got sacked because they basically came out with a ruling that the administration wasn't happy with, so that created a constitutional crisis, and many argue that the judiciary hasn't recovered until today. Freedom of the media was also severely curtailed. Many of the mainstream newspaper outlets were bought over by political parties. UMNO currently owns the #1 Malay newspaper in the country, and at the time also many opposition leaders and activists were jailed under the Internal Security Act, which allows for detention without trial. So we see some backsliding then, which then continued on, I think, until the recent elections. So just going to add a bit more on affirmative action. So in 1969, we had racial riots that it was mainly a Malay versus Chinese riots that broke out in the city, and many innocent lives were lost. And then as a result of that, the UMNO government saw the need to really uplift Malays from this disadvantageous economic position. So they enacted the new economic policy, the NEP, which one of the aims was to increase Bumiputra equity in the stock market, and the NEP also introduced many other affirmative action policies. We should have ended in 1990, but many of the policies still live on. So the NEP is also another big source of contention within Malaysia until today. And then on May 9th, 2018, the opposition coalition, now the government, finally won the elections, and UMNO was out of power for the first time in 60 years. There are many reasons for this. During the Q&A we can get into that if you're interested to know. But currently, we're already seeing some backlash, I think, from Malaysians who are not very comfortable with this new government's more multiracial, pluralistic nature. One of the component parties in the current coalition in power is a predominantly Chinese party, the Democratic Action Party, which has its roots from the Singapore's PAP, the People's Action Party. So there's been some backlash with the ratification of the International Convention of Elimination of Racial Discrimination, ICED. Many Malays are afraid that will erode their rights under the Constitution. And I remain cautious with this, and yes, so I think that's roughly what I would have to say about Malaysia. Looking forward to the discussion with that.
So thank you very much to the panel for really a wide-ranging discussion already and keeping within time. The discussion has already covered several levels from the examination of core values, what has been chosen to glue societies together, the issue of therefore the native ethnic diversity and religious diversity in countries, and the need and the choice therefore of the glue, and how does that affect what has become the nation. And therefore, the need to juxtapose this or explore this in relation to the values of democracy that had been discussed earlier, namely plurality, rights, or dignity, and equity, inclusion, which it was stressed was very important that this be understood in terms of the local context, and that therefore it was perhaps an important role of the middle power countries to help to bring about this interpretation or translation between what has been seen as developed Western values for democracy in relation to the local context on which these need to become relevant. The issue of that this, of course, needs to translate into how the state has been formed, what is the constitution of the state, and the governance practice that is now in place. And several issues raised particularly by Nisha of how it is important that bureaucracies are formed, updated, improved, as it may have been happening already in other countries and contexts. The need to look at the judiciary, corruption, and the old habits, feudal, what has been mentioned as possible feudal values that are there, and these are how are these affecting now the democratic practices and governance that we are seeking to push. The need for social inclusion, empowerment, and maybe the need for affirmative action to bring about social inclusion and empowerment. Put this into the broader context of looking at ASEAN as a particular community with more shared platforms. And then finally, examining this in the context of the juxtaposition between China and the United States, and the categories, relating this to the categories of values, of perspectives on democracy, and liberal democracy in particular, and how they look therefore at China and the United States. So we would like to deepen this discussion further on any of these levels, the exploration of what is in fact in the local context, the local values that are there, to the sub-Asian communities that are in fact in place. And again, it looks like the issue of the United States and China is going to be prevailing, even though some of us are saying it is not really so important. It is apparently going to be part of this discourse. So we open now the floor for discussion. Please identify yourself, your institution, and if you want to direct your question to someone. I will dig deep from the margins, so we start there. And then we will, the first, and then we will, since we have not had a woman from the floor, go next. Yes, please.
My name is John. I'm a journalist and PhD scholar, and I'm from Myanmar. I don't agree with that people are satisfied with the government, let them lead the country. for democracy. Let them do the government. I don't think people are satisfied. But people just realize it was made by who hold the power, made the format of democracy. It's just a form, but it's not functioning democracy in many countries in Asia. So I don't agree with people satisfied. I can make many statistics, it's not difficult to make statistics people who not satisfied. And another problem is a lot of civil society, as Sri Lanka said, they don't like NGO. Because in Asia, a lot of NGO has problem. But it's a kind of only showcase. I can see a lot of NGO like the same face, same person all the time, So it's not really changing the democracy or not really functioning democracy. And many network regional organizations, they are doing with those NGO because it's easy to work. So that is the problem of civil society NGO in Asia. So in my suggestions, we have to change, really change all these, it's a kind of civilian dictatorship, we have to change those things, then we can really make, we can do functioning democracy. Like, we can rely on like middle power, like Japan, Australia, I think they can do leading or making a good institution or network in Asia. Then we can become a good democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Anissa and I'm from Indonesia. Currently I'm studying in PhD program in GSIS of Korea University. Since you are mostly from Southeast Asia, because I'm also from Southeast Asia, so I want to note about the current rising of religious politics in most of the countries, especially in my countries, because it's like hot issues, especially that we have upcoming elections next year. Do you think that because it's like some people say that Islam and mostly it's Islam rising in my country. Islam is not like the opposite sides of democracy, but some people say that, especially the radical side, say that because democracy is not produced by the Prophet Muhammad, already didn't teach us about that in the Quran, so it's like it's created by the kafir people in the Western, things like that. So it's like the opposite side of democracy. It's kind of, there are many people like the radicals want to keep kind of campaigning that democracy is bad, things like that. Do you think it kind of work for some people? They kind of agree with that, and that become like one of the reasons why there are hashtags like 2009 change the president, and they support the other candidate for that kind of reasons. So what do you think about that kind of race in religion in terms of, is it hindering democracy or it can go hand in hand?
Thank you. We'll take one more and then we'll yes. And you.
Thank you. Thank you, moderator. I am Narayan. I am from Nepal and I am Koika Fellow student in Sanggugan University. My question, I think my question doesn't indicate to any panelist, but it concerns to all. I have a bit different perspective of this democratic value. I just focused on the effect of the internet technology or social media, social networking media in changing the value of democratic value. Because as we found that sometimes social media or social networking site has a strong or powerful effect than the ballot box because it creates moral tension or moral effect to the politician for the accountability. So how we scholar are searching for the new democratic value which create or affected by the social media. What types of democratic value we have to think about that because the coverage of the social media is very huge and democratic value which depends on the relies on the election. It creates accountability in every 4 or 5 years. But the role of the social media creates value within 1 hour. So what types of democratic value we have to think about and we have to make a politician accountable? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll just give maybe 2 minutes each, so we can do a second round.
Sure.
And you can pick up any of the questions. They refer to the dissatisfaction with democracy, civil society, lack of integrity, religious sentiments, and social media.
Is it okay if I do a little more than 2 because and answer the last question?
All right.
I think the social media question is very important because it is, it's been the fad today.
I have lots of people from the US come to me and say, how are you dealing with fake news? Okay. And my response is very simple. Actually, it's not such a problem in our countries the way it is in the US, because for the US it's a new problem. We have always lived with fake news. We have never trusted our media. The sources of the fake news problem emerges not because we live in a post-truth society, that's a complete mistake in thinking, but because sources of legitimacy have lost legitimacy. And when there are no sources of legitimacy to anchor what people believe, then people tend to believe all sorts of things. And from Asia, I'm very accustomed to being the norm. Rumors and other things are very powerful in shaping democratic or societal outcomes. And social media just gives it a different flavor. And it's not all bad. Social media is the one channel, the democratizing channel that we have to challenge the government's control over mainstream media and the message. And it is a very important channel, so much so that government is trying to control social media today in our country as well and invest a lot in social media. So I think we have a very different experience of social media from the West, and we mustn't be allowed to color our interpretation just because of the problem that the Americans had with the election of Donald Trump. It brings me to the importance of discourse. That democracy must be seen fundamentally as government through conversation. I was happy to hear that Ambassador Takasu worked with Amartya Sen. He was my teacher in philosophy, so small generation gap. And Amartya Sen introduces the idea that democracy is not just public balloting, but public reasoning. And public reasoning requires, actually, first of all, better data and information infrastructure. So the problem of famines went away partially because of better data, better information that got created in democratic societies, and also because society was able to talk about it, the famine, and get upset about it, and get upset with government, not because the people who suffered famine, voted against the government. So really, I think talking about how middle powers can help build better data infrastructure. But also build values like right to information. India's right to information bill really helps Sri Lanka pass it, because we wouldn't have passed it just because Western countries had it. We are, the post-colonial mindset says we are happy to imitate Asian countries, and that's socially more legitimate than imitating the West. And so the RTI's success in India helped Sri Lanka to pass RTI, and that's having enormous value. And I think that discourse can't be limited just to inside the country. Now, Asian countries have this idea that, we mustn't interfere in your country, we won't tell you what to do. But the value of discourse is that we tell each other what we think. We tell each other what our values are. And the impartiality, the objectivity that comes from somebody external reflecting on what they think about you is so important. So I would say middle powers need to change this approach. I'm good with it. And not simply say, oh, we don't interfere, we don't tell you about values, we only give you money, we only give you investment. And start, if they do have democratic values, start expressing them and expressing concern around democratic norms and democratic institutions, which currently they are abdicating that responsibility and leaving it to the West. I'll stop there for the moment. Yeah.
I think I'll address your question, Anissa, right, about religious politics. That's always a tough one, but I think Malaysia and Indonesia, we can sort of relate to that experience coming from Southeast Asia with the majority Muslim population country. My opinion is that politics guided by religious values, whatever that religion may be, it might be Islam or Christianity or Buddhism, is fine, and in fact I would say that there is a value to that. But I think the problem in our societies, and I see this both in Malaysia and in Indonesia, is when the state uses religion as a tool to intimidate or to assert power, which then becomes the problem. So I think you are probably referring to when the whole Ahok crisis happened in Indonesia, and that was quite surprising to me actually. Not living in Indonesia, because I've always seen Indonesia as more sort of the discourse around Islam has always been more vibrant, I think, than in Malaysia. But then I think there was also a lot of politics behind the Ahok riots, where it was argued that his opponent at the time was the one who was behind this whole issue with him and the so-called blasphemy case. And sharing from my experience in Malaysia, I explained about Islam being the religion of the Federation, which is prescribed in the Constitution, and then no one actually really knows what that means, and there's been so little discourse between the different religions and races about what that means actually, because then now you see a situation where a predominantly Malay government, and we also have an Islamist party who then bandies this Islamist religion federation around the place, saying that this validates whatever it is that we are trying to do. So this validates the Islamization of our education system and many other things that have caused a lot of dissatisfaction. So I would say politics guided by religion, but I'm very, very hesitant to agree with any constitutionally mandated official religion anywhere. So yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure that I'm going to answer the questions, but I would like to add something apart from the asking only satisfaction with democracy, but for Asian Barometer Survey, we dig deeply into the autocratic-oriented or democratic-oriented, but we see some change in the value of the people in Asia, especially in ASEAN, like Thailand. The people seem to be more autocratic-oriented than before. So that's problematic that we have to consider. And we found that the young generation has less democratic value than the seniority, and the people living in Bangkok have more autocratic value than the people living in the rural area, for example. That's why I propose that we should look at the support for democracy based on the substance, like we should look at civic education. So what the mature democracy country can support us is by strengthening civic education in this country and learn from the best practice in those countries, and also strengthening civil society in promoting civic education instead of protest against the government, because it creates more conflict. So why not looking at deliberative democracy Actually, I think that's work in the rural area and let the people learn about democratic practice without telling them what is democracy. And then that will dig deeply into their heart. That means not only use head or knowledge or wisdom, but they use heart, that means relationship with the people, compassion, legitimacy, and compassion, and then have inclusiveness idea. So I think that will be work and will be the good collaboration among the countries toward middle power and the young democracy.
I also talked about liberal democratic value. When I make my presentation and the B make his presentation, we use the Asian Barometer survey. We have a battery about liberal democratic value, which basically asks people's attitude about constraint on government power and judicial independence and civil society organization free from state control, and how about a strong leader decide everything for us. It's this kind of question. This kind of question are designed actually during the authoritarian transition period in those regions that we want to ask people their attitude about the power of the executive. We want to have people to express how they want to constrain the power of the executive. But I don't think they are quite enough right now, because now I think with the popularity of social media, we need to emphasize more on tolerance, because tolerance is not included in our battery of the liberal democratic value. So how we tolerate people with different views, I think that's important. I think they should be probably included in the civil education and probably in our future studies, and how to be more inclusive. As we say, how to be more inclusive. I think we are also to consider this part.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes left. We'll take.
I think we started 15 minutes late, so I'm still finishing that time.
Okay. Anyway, how many more hands? Okay. So we'll do the last 3 and then give 1 minute round. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your kind discussion and contribution about the values of the democracy. First of all, I will make my second question. I'm Jeta Kai from Myanmar. I'm now studying at Sanjamon University and scholarship for Bible. So I would like to make a question. I have so many questions, but I only one question about as of the time constraint. So I want to address to Mr. Nisha, so from Sri Lanka. So about your very good, very informative contribution during your discussion. And so my question is concerned with the pluralism of rights and also the core value of the democracy. So how about your, I want to know your opinions. So how about your hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure? So it's up, as you have already mentioned in the discussion. So these infrastructures are very correlated, very closely interrelated with each other. So for example, now I'm studying e-government or e-government implementation. So there might be the productivity and democracy and reflexivity. These are very correlated. So it is concerned with the hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. So productivity, democracy, and reflexivity are very correlated. So I would like to know about your opinions of which ones shall we put the first priority, or whether it is in hard infrastructure or soft infrastructure in dealing with the core values of the democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. And then how many more hands? The last question.
Thank you, moderator. I don't think mine is a question, but maybe a contribution.
Your name?
I'm Richard from the same Sangyuan University. I think the quality of any democratic institution depends on their success in balancing unity and diversity, in balancing coordination and unit autonomy. At the same time, the ability to act in coherent and purposeful way, and at the same time respect and accommodate legitimate diversity and conflict. In our quest to come up with democratic unity in Asia, I think we should give more attention to these issues of diversity, these issues of unit autonomy. There should be more discourse, there should be more discussions on these fronts so that we can be able to integrate them and be able to move ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, from Pakistan.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Tehseen. And my question is to my dear friend Nishad Saab. The language both of us are speaking has not been taught by any of the Asian countries. Culture is not a static thing. Gone are the days that women are considered in our societies that they are double burdened. Women questions, and all of these three questions have a very solid class issue, class-based in fact. Therefore, would you agree with me that there's no such thing as a static culture? Therefore, saying that is it appropriate to say that, if anything is from the West, and especially the clothes you are wearing, and myself too, these are not Asian clothes. They're all Western. And the first time ever in my life I saw a bidet, that was in Sri Lanka, not in Australia.
France is where it came from.
Right? So the point I'm trying to, my question again is, I think this is high time we should look at our own histories, cultures, moral values, ethics. It's slightly a different manner. Thank you very much.
We'll now, and this will be your concluding remarks, respond to the questions and the comments, and maybe have one final suggestion as to how we move forward from this particular conversation.
Super. So I'll start with Bashir.
Of course, it's a truism. There is no such thing as static culture. Culture means automatically something that is dynamic and evolving all the time. What I'm trying to do is to point out some unique properties that we experience in our own context and in Asia that may not be known to the West for sure. And where what we are calling middle powers may have had to struggle with in a different way and see more evolution or dynamism than we have experienced ourselves. Okay, so in Sri Lanka, for the longest time, women could not go to a boys' school, even their son's school, without dressing in a very particular way. And there was appropriate dress for women. And this was until 2 years ago till we fought it and changed it. This lasted 20 odd years. And we fought it on social media, by the way, and won that debate. And the government changed it. So I can give you umpteen amount of examples, I don't want to do that now, where we exhibit characteristics that are different and that need to be addressed in a democratization process of changing values. Of course, I also agree with you that democratic values aren't Western values. So the argumentative Indian, by Sen, is saying that in our roots and in our history and in our culture, we will find values that support democracy. That's exactly what I'm saying. That we should work to translate our history and our culture and relate it to democratic values without looking for the path and the evolution, the process of translation and thinking that has been adopted only in the West, which doesn't sit well with our own history and culture. Not that our history and culture is against democracy, it's just that it needs a different translation into democratic values. I hope that answers your question. Okay. Coming to your question about soft infrastructure and hard infrastructure, My argument has been, I think, that both are needed. The way I've argued for hard infrastructure is that, you can't simply advance democracy if it doesn't also advance actual lived outcomes of people. So when the West had to fight communism, it built a welfare state. Because really the attraction of communism was very much the fact that the poor were attracted to communism. They still are in our societies. And the welfare state was a response. So democracy can't be only about process. It also must be about outcomes. And if the outcomes are not getting delivered, or the outcomes are being expropriated or exploited, then our democracy has a problem, and we must link democracy more to outcomes. So hard infrastructure becomes quite valuable in doing that. But man shall not live by bread alone. The hard infrastructure we build does not translate to a society that is more free, and freedom is of intrinsic value, a society that is more just, and the society that promotes the common good without values that enable us to care about the other, that link us to the marginalized in terms of our empathy, in terms of how we vote. We cannot be just self-interested in the way we vote. We have to care about those who are marginalized in our society. We have to create openness for democracy to work. That's a value. Asian cultures tend to be not only hierarchical, but quite closed. There's a view in the Sri Lanka's Board of Investment that to do business with the Japanese, you need to have a secretive, closed culture, because Japanese like to make deals, whereas the West likes to play by rules. This may be completely wrong, but we have this myth about Asian culture that needs to be challenged and changed. And the soft infrastructure is changing its value system in a way that fosters freedom, fosters justice, and fosters the common good. And you can't just do it on the heart alone, but both are needed. So thank you for asking that question. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll give them the time that's needed, but please think of the right to eat.
Okay, so just some short concluding remarks. I think with Malaysia's story, overnight Malaysia sort of became this new beacon of hope and democracy in the region and in the world, with all this democratic backsliding going on, even in our region. I always feel when I hear King and her brave struggle in the Philippines. And Philippines, of course, was such an icon in democracy in Southeast Asia in the 80s. But I would like to just say that moving forward, I really hope that the more fundamental aspects of our nation will get sort of not solved. I don't think you can solve them in 1 or 2 terms, but at least we can have a national conversation about it. Start to have a more mature national conversation about things like affirmative action. What does Malay rights mean? What does Islam as the official religion of the Federation mean? In our march towards becoming a more open society, I think this is absolutely crucial, and we must not take the electoral victory for granted, because changing governments is one thing, and of course that's one step, but then how do we sort of get that to trickle down into the more fundamental aspects of our society? So and I hope to see that as well with our neighbors in the region. So yeah, I think that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I just would like to propose the new normal movement. That is democratic governance. With our foundation of democracy, I think Thailand will suffer with another coup again. So what I would like to ask our friends from within power countries to help is that help strengthening the foundation of democracy, especially democratic value, by supporting the way of practice, like the human rights practice, gender equality practice, pluralism practice. That can be the example for the governance in the future. Thank you.
Reiterate the importance of engaging with Chinese people. And I remember when in 1989, when the famous Russian literature Nobel laureate. His name is very difficult to pronounce. I tried here. I think it's Soronism, right? He came to Taiwan, and at that time, Taiwanese were always worried about can we survive because China is so powerful. And he told us in his talk that the most important guarantee of Taiwan's security is not a weapon or any guarantee from the United States, but it's how Chinese people think, their attitude toward Taiwan. If they love democracy, then love freedom, then you are safe. That's it. Thank you.
So thank you. We are a bit over time, but I hope it has been a conversation that has filled our minds. If we have more questions at the end of the session than before we came in, I think that's a good sign, because it would mean that there will be more conversations going. I think we have more questions. The need to understand more, talk among ourselves, understand more what being middle power is about, what the fledgling or troubled democracies are going through, the need to connect all of this to understand better the connections between democratic politics, good governance, and outcomes, because it's a virtuous cycle that has to happen, which needs social inclusion in terms of class, ethnicity, gender, and generation. Old and young have to talk more. And how do we really educate for this so that civic education is not just something that falls into a box and in the end people really don't understand what democracy is about. So I hope this has been a worthwhile discussion. I hope our resolve from here is that yes, we need to talk more middle powers among themselves, fledgling democracies among ourselves, and then across we need to really learn more how to defend, restore in some cases, how to strengthen democracy as still the basis of the outcomes that we want for all our people. Thank you.
Cannot hear you.